So this is a bit of a summary of what I called the Cassirian school of philosophy. I'm pulling out the bare components of it for you. And Ernst Cassirer is a 20th century German philosopher, and Susan K. Langer was his follower. And some traces of this philosophy is also found in the work of Bernard Lonergan, too. But it's definitely not the mainstream of philosophy of language. So we're on a sidewater here. And what's striking about this school of the philosophy of language or the philosophy of consciousness is that it gives primacy to the aesthetic object, as we were talking about earlier. You know, the aesthetic object, the art object, the visual symbol is first, and the prosaic word follows. So first comes poetry, then prose, just like in the life of a child. Also crucial to this school is a distinction between non-human animal consciousness and human consciousness. Note what I said, non-human animal consciousness. There is consciousness in animals. We can see it, we observe it. But it's of a different kind than the consciousness that is predominant in the human. Some of that non-human animal consciousness is also in us, and so we can see a commonality in certain patterns of consciousness found in, let's say, the higher animals and ourselves, but there's something very distinctive about human consciousness, which is primarily expressed in things like art and poetry and symbolic life. So that brings me to the first thesis here. Common to all forms of intelligence, natural, human, and artificial, is communication through sign usage or signaling. There is no communication without signs or signals. Signs are the necessary and sufficient media of communication. All intelligence, therefore, natural, human, and artificial, if it be allowed, is communicative. So a beaver slaps its tail to communicate to other beavers the presence of danger. Mating calls, barks, growls. Also you, when you go, ow, or say, hey. This is, in the Cassirer school, technically speaking, signaling, not symbolizing. Only human intelligence communicates sense or meaning. That's the second thesis. So when I'm signaling, when I go, hey, look out, we're not communicating meaning. Now you might think, well, of course it means something. It means look out. But in order to see the point of the argument here, we have to recognize that sense is something other than pointing to a situation or an object. You know, when I say, hey, your reaction is to look around. If I say, look out, you look out. You don't stop and conceive something in abstraction from the context. But in the whole sentence that I just uttered, you didn't look around. You didn't turn to a context or look for objects. What you did was you conceived the sense of my words. They are functionally different kinds of communication. And we do both, but what's most typical of the human is not sign usage, but symbol usage. Non-symbolic signs that are used in a non-symbolic way, are the media for the communication of information, the presence of danger, mating calls, transmission of data. So this is also a way that I think is useful for understanding what's going on with AI. But you do not communicate sense through a sign, a non-symbolic sign. There's no conception required for signaling. The communication of sense, third thesis, is only possible by means of the transformation of signs into symbols, something which seems to have occurred uniquely in evolutionary history with the first appearance of modern humans 200,000 years ago, give or take 100,000 years, possibly over 1 million years ago with the first hominoids, Homo erectus, although we have less evidence of their symbolic consciousness. But I did tell you about the little shell with the scratches on it. Yes, that's only just found in the last 2014. Yeah. Okay, let's slow down a little bit here. So, the communication of sense is possible by means of the transformation of signs into symbols. So, all symbols are signs in a certain way, but not all signs are symbols. So a sign stands for something, you could say. But some signs are used as direct indices or indicators, like my hand, pointing to objects in the world, present or anticipated or recently present. Signs bring you into context. I'll give you an example in a moment. Whereas the symbol immediately lifts you out of context. So, for example, with a sign, the proper response is a certain kind of action. With a symbol, the proper response is not an action at all, but it's what we could call contemplation or thought. So when you see a hexagonal red shape on the street, you don't stop and contemplate it, you stop and look for traffic. But when I say to you, let me continue with that, the signaling business. And if I call out a person's name, you look around to see to whom I'm calling. Or if you're the person whom I'm calling, you say, yeah, what? Right? But I can also utter a person's name in absentia. I could say, for example, do you know Garth Green? And the proper response to that utterance is not to look around. Where's Garth Green? Is he here? Was he here? No, you're all right. What are you going to say about Garth? Gossiping is something that you can only do in a symbolic key. The other point that Cassirer makes quite vividly is symbols are total. Like in the sign world, there might be signs for some things, but not for others. It's not like you go around pointing to everything with a sign. Beaver slaps its tail, but I don't know if it does much else in terms of communication. Perhaps it has a few other cool things it does. We don't want to be hating on beavers. I love beavers. They're very clever, and most animals are better sign users than humans. Way better at signaling because they're much more contextually bound. Whereas we are in la-la land. We are in the symbolic order. That's why we trip over our feet and forget where we are and forget to eat when we're studying. That's why you're all looking at me. We're involved in a symbolic discourse. And that symbolic discourse, in a certain way, is not particularly suitable if we're in a kind of life or death struggle with the environment, right? That's when the sign usage becomes much more useful. But the symbolic is total, it's complete. No symbol stands by itself. And we don't build them up piece by piece. Here's a symbol, I draw a horse. Here's another, a bison, and then build up the symbolic universe. The symbolic universe comes complete and entire all at once. You're in it. Children enter into it as their ego develops. And they take up residence in it. And it's like an environment. It's like a womb. This is why Cassirer talks about the symbolic order as a kind of the environment natural to a human being, just like there's an environment natural to a sea urchin and an environment natural to a beaver. There's an environment that is natural to a human, and that environment is symbolic. So let's look at what Cassirer says. Here's a piece from the essay on man. No longer in a merely physical universe, man lives in a symbolic universe. Language, myth, art, and religion are parts of this universe. They are the varied threads which weave this symbolic net, the tangled web of human experience. All human progress in thought and experience refines upon and strengthens this net. No longer can man confront reality immediately. He cannot see it, as it were, face to face. Physical reality seems to recede in proportion as it is man's symbolic activity advances. Instead of dealing with the things themselves, man is, in a sense, constantly conversing with himself. So there was this account of Helen Keller learning to write. Did you read that? It was in both readings. It's such a striking example of what Cassirer is describing, the entrance into the symbolic, that I think I'll read it to you. You all know who Helen Keller was, presumably, a deaf-dumb child who was trained to speak and write and became an articulate writer and reported back from a world of complete sensory isolation in a certain way. All she had was her sense of touch through which she mediated the world. But once she entered the symbolic, the whole world was there for her. She was not outside the human at all. And this is the point Cassirer and Langer want to make. The medium of the symbol can be extremely crude. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. It could just be the touch of the shape of a hand spelling out a word in the little tiny hand of Helen Keller, which is what it is here. So I'm looking at Cassirer's account of the thing, and this is Anne Sullivan, her nurse, describing how Helen entered the symbolic. So it's page 30, the bottom of page 33 in the essay on that. Well, actually, go to the next page, page 34. This is a quote from Helen Keller herself, actually. It can't be her. It must be Anne Sullivan. Yeah, writing about Helen. I must write you on a line this morning because something very important has happened. It's the early 20th century that we're not writing online. Something very important has happened. Helen has taken the second great step in her education. She has learned that everything has a name and that the manual alphabet is the key to everything she wants to know. This morning, while she was washing, she wanted to know the name for water. When she wants to know the name of anything, she points to it and pats my hand. I spelled W-A-T-E-R with sign language in her hand, and thought no more about it until after breakfast. Later on, we went out to the pump house, and I made Helen hold her mug under the spout while I pumped. As the cold water gushed forth, filling the mug, I spelled W-A-T-E-R in Helen's free hand. The word, coming so close upon the sensation of cold water rushing over her hand, seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and she stood as one transfixed. A new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped on the ground and asked for its name and pointed to the pump and the trellis, and suddenly turning round, she asked for my name. I spelled teacher. All the way back to the house, she was highly excited and learned the name of every object she touched, so that in a few hours, she had added 30 new words to her vocabulary. The next morning, she got up like a radiant fairy. She has flitted from object to object, asking the name of everything, and kissing me for very gladness. Everything must have a name. Wherever we go, she asks eagerly for the names of things she has not learned at home. She is anxious for her friends to spell and eager to teach the letters to everyone she meets. She drops the signs and pantomimes she used before. The signs and the pantomimes, interesting. As soon as she has words to supply their place, and the acquirement of a new word affords her the liveliest pleasure. And we notice that her face grows more expressive each day. That's the end of the quote from Helen Keller, The Story of My Life. And this is what Cassirer says. The decisive step leading from the use of signs and pantomime to the use of words, which are symbols, that is, of symbols, could scarcely be described in a more striking manner. What was the child's real discovery at this moment? Helen Keller had previously learned to combine a certain thing or event with a certain sign of the manual alphabet. A fixed association had been established between these things and certain tactile impressions. But a series of such associations, even if they are repeated and amplified, still does not imply an understanding of what human speech is and means. In order to arrive at such an understanding, the child had to make a new and much more significant discovery. It had to understand that everything has a name, that the symbolic function is not restricted to particular cases, but is a principle of universal applicability, which encompasses the whole field of human thought. So the idea here is that the entrance into the symbolic universe, which is the human environment, is closed to all those who cannot use signs in this symbolic way. And in this context, we look at efforts to train chimps to speak and monkeys to write and elephants to paint, and we see stunning results of how cleverly they can become responsive to our training. But we never see, according to the argument, that entrance into the symbolic. This is not a popular argument anymore. This is an argument concerning the human difference. It's much more popular to say, oh, we're just animals. And anyway, how do you know that the dolphin's not having a wild symbolic time in the ocean? Well, the only evidence we have for symbolic consciousness is the kind of thing we see on the cave wall. If you could say, oh, that's so human-centric, well, that's exactly what we're talking about. What is it to be human-centric? What does a human environment look like? What is distinctive of the human animal? Yes?
I was thinking about the idea of mimicry.
Yeah.
We are teaching animals to do things. We're actually trying to mimic our concepts of an action. So then, what do we do when we are maybe in a religious practice and we are mimicking other humans doing
Ritual.
ritual in order to create symbolism for ourselves?
Ritual is symbol, yeah. Ritual is gestures as symbol. These are symbols. They're symbols that are performed rather than illustrated or written out. It's a communication. I just communicated sense, meaning. Let's continue a little further, and then we'll get into Langer. She's very good at this stuff too. In a certain way, she brings it even further. This is Cassirer again. Man can construct his symbolic world out of the poorest and scantest materials, e.g. as in Helen Keller's case. The thing of vital importance is not the individual bricks and stones, but their general function as architectural form. A symbol is not only universal, but extremely variable. A sign or signal is related to the thing to which it refers, on the other hand, in a fixed and unique way. So signals indicate one thing. They don't have an ambiguity of reference. If they had an ambiguity of reference, they wouldn't work. Symbols, on the contrary, particularly aesthetic symbols and visual symbols, are oscillating with ambiguity. And the ambiguity is wonderful. It is the experience of overdetermination of meaning, of an excess of intelligibility. Think of dream symbols, for example. They don't simply mean one thing, they mean many things. Or religious symbols, such as the sign of the cross. I said I communicated sense. But what sense did I communicate? How many senses did I communicate? As many people as there are in the room? Could we define the meaning of that gesture the way we define the meaning of the symbol CO2? Wouldn't it be some kind of reduction? So this excessive intelligibility of the symbolic is what another writer in the catalog that I gave you, in the drive I gave you, Wheelwright, calls tensive symbols, metaphor. Right? Metaphors fascinate us because they mean multiple things. A visual symbol is tensive because in it we see a tension between many different meanings, some of which are contradictory. A symbol can actually productively stand for opposed meanings. The symbol of salvation, the symbol of tyranny. Let's just read the last bit here. Let's get to Langer now. She's very good. This is Langer, Philosophy of a New Key. Symbols are not proxy for their object. That's a typo. Proxy for their object. That means they don't stand for their object in a direct way, but they are vehicles for the conception of objects. That is, they are abstract, to use a much maligned term, but using it in a scholastic sense. We lift out of the contextual, the here and now, into something universal when we abstract. To conceive a thing or a situation is not the same thing as to react towards it overtly or to be aware of its presence. In talking about things, we have conceptions of them, not the things themselves. And it is the conceptions, not the things, that the symbols directly mean. Of course, a word may be used as a sign, hey, look out, Garth. But that is not its primary role. Think of how few the proper names are in the English language. Why wouldn't everything be a proper name? Every object having a name assigned just to it. That's what language would look like if language was significative rather than symbolic. Its significant character has to be indicated by some special modification, by a tone of voice or a gesture. You know, you see, I'm signaling rather than symbolizing because I gesture in a certain way, I use my voice in a certain way, I call out, I make a loud sound. In itself, a word is a symbol associated with a conception, not directly with a public object or event. Signs announce their objects to the interpreter, whereas symbols lead him to conceive their objects. Yeah, so the reason for this little detour in the forgotten philosophy of language of Ernst Cassirer is because religion is primarily a symbolic discourse. And what we see